Good afternoon to everyone and anyone who'd be listening. Today is the 13th of October 2025 and it is 1:39 p.m. as I speak. I have decided to title today's topic The Anti-imperialist Flaw, colon, Not Your Mother's Son. It's quite an interesting title and there are two men at the center of what I plan to discuss today. It's quite an interesting combination because the two men at the center of what I plan to discuss are Sheun Kuti and Minister K Strings. I guess that Sheun Kuti is much more popular because of I would say almost that his reputation precedes him in that we know the Kuti family to be sort of a family of musical icons, amongst other things, great activism. However, Minister K Strings, for those who don't know, is a Nigerian gospel singer, and these two have inspired what I plan to discuss today. Anyway, so yes, the anti imperialist flaw. What exactly do I plan to do in today's discourse? My aim today is not to refute or debunk the rhetoric of the anti imperialist, but I plan to point out a few inconsistencies in their talking points and in what they do. So before I go ahead, I would just like to define the key terms the in my topic. So anti-imperialism is the opposition of the idea of one country ruling or having a lot of power or influence over another country, right? So at the heart of anti imperialism is neocolonialism, and a major proponent, especially in Africa, of this idea of neocolonialism would be Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah. And in his book, I have the title here. All right, so in his book on new colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, I'm taking a quote from what he said there. He said, "The essence of neocolonialism is that the state, which is subject to it, in theory, independent, but in reality, its economic system and political policies are directed from outside." So it's basically the idea that although especially African nations would would become independent or are independent, there is a sort of indirect colonial rule which would be experienced in the African state. Now, the whole idea of anti imperialism is not only unique to Africa or African thinkers, but yes, I would be picking on the works of Kwame Nkrumah and Thomas Sankara. Now, a key idea in the neocolonialism is the idea of the effect of foreign aids and loans, right? And Thomas Sankara had a very interesting perspective. Almost, I would say, I would quote some other works or some other ideas or ideologies of Thomas Sankara as I go on, but he was, if I may say, a man ahead of his times in a lot of ways. He said about the idea of foreign aids, this is to quote him, he said, "The one who feeds you usually imposes his own will upon you," essentially meaning that the foreign aids from the West were a sort of, would I say, an attempt at neocolonialism. And that wasn't just his only idea, that would be his idea on foreign aid, or a statement of his on the on foreign aid. But he also spoke about loans, right? Taking loans, African countries taking loans. And to quote him, he said, "Death is cleverly managed reconquest of Africa aimed at subjugating its growth and development through foreign rules and regulations, in that the African nations would almost forever remain indebted to the Western nations, and that would be a sort of indirect method of colonialism. Now, there are actual concerns, right, in this whole idea of anti-imperialism, and Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, and a lot of other thinkers have actual concerns. But I plan to, as I said, point out certain inconsistencies, and this would be when I would say almost that certain anti imperialists are chasing shadows. Now, here's what I mean. And to buttress my claim in that they may be chasing shadows or they may be involving or getting attached to things that are not of their own interest. I'm particularly speaking about the anti imperialist notion of language and religion. So we have more contemporary thinkers, more contemporary anti imperialist, major one being Sheon Kuti, who has influenced or would I say impacted on what I want to speak about, almost chasing the shadow of language. And I know that there are a lot of other contemporary anti-imperialists, but at least I would say that for Sheon Kuti, he's self-proclaimed, right? He's come out a number of times to speak particularly on the idea of religion and language. And with language, you'd hear a lot of thinkers saying things like a lot of developing nations speak their own language, right? And so if Nigeria must progress, we need to speak our own language and sort of abandon the English language, and how our education system is highly westernized, right? And this could also be a sort of neo-colonialism in that it places the white man above the black man in certain sense, placing his culture above the black man's culture. Now, I I don't know if you have noticed, but I have so far been referring to the West and to the white man, and I would go on to explain why I have restricted this idea of anti imperialism to the West. Because, as I said earlier, it could be any nation at all, any nation imposing its influence on another nation, another independent nation, is an imperialist act, right? But whenever a lot of African thinkers speak on the idea of anti imperialism, there's usually a restriction to the West, right? And to the white man, and particularly to the idea of chasing shadows in religion, would be the thinkers like Sheon Kuti saying things of how Christians and, to be fair, Muslims have a sort of almost an intellectual, to put simply, people who practiced the Abrahamic religions have a sort of inferiority complex where they have accepted the white man delusion that all their gods, the traditional gods, the Shango, the Ifa, all of them are demons. They have relegated those gods to being demons, and they have accepted, in quotes, the white man's god to be their god. Well, their actual gods have now become demons to them. He has a lot of, these interesting ideas. And I would pick particularly on the idea of religion, his idea on religion. Now, I'll just put it out there firstly that Christianity is not a white man's religion, as he often as he often points out. But Christianity, if at all we have to, tag Christianity to be of any part of the world, would say it's more so a Middle Eastern religion, right? Having its origin from Israel. And of course, Islam would then be tagged to Saudi Arabia, Mecca, Medina, things like that. And I would side with this notion just very well. I would side with Sheon Kuti on his idea of religion just very well, in that the Christians and Muslims would relegate the traditional gods, Ifa, Shango, Irumole, whatever, to being demons and then hold on to the Abrahamic religion. Now, here's why I'm siding with him for a while, and I'm going to be speaking particularly about Christians. And of course, if you meet an average Christian on the street, you ask them, "Oh, what do you think about traditional worshippers? What do you think about people who worship Shango?" There's a part in Yoruba land that worships Eshu, although they claim that the Eshu is not, as we know in Christendom, to be the devil, right? There are all of these gods, Oshun. If you ask the average Christian, do you worship the same God as an Ifa worshipper? They would blow out, no, right? We do not worship the same God. That's demon worship, that's satanic. They are involved in a lot of satanic practices. However, if you ask that same Christian, do you worship the same God as a Muslim? They would have a more sympathetic answer, almost to be politically correct. Some of them indeed don't aim for political correctness, but actually do not know. And they would say, of course, yes, Christians and Muslims worship the same God. And so this is to side with Sheon Kuti's point on the whitewashing, or would I say, of the Abrahamic religions. Because in actuality, Christians and Muslims do not worship the same God. Now, follow me through, okay? Because it's very easy to say, oh, the Ifa worshippers, demon, false god. But then when we say Islam, they're like, no, of course, Allah, God, Jesus. In fact, Jesus is seen in Islam, and there would be all of this, apologetics to try to make things go together. I even once heard someone say that Christianity and Islam are the most related religions. Now, here's what I mean, right? And the Christian faith, central to the Christian faith, is the deity of Christ. And by deity of Christ, I mean Jesus Christ is God. That is central to the Christian faith. Jesus Christ was not a human who gradually progressed in consciousness to become God. He was not just, a guru or anything that other religions may put him to be. He was not just a prophet. He is God. That is very central to the Christian faith. However, you look on Islam, and although Jesus is venerated as a prophet, in fact, probably second to Prophet Muhammad in Islam, Jesus would be probably the most venerated prophet. But it's not enough that Jesus is a prophet, because central to the Christian faith is that Jesus is God. And so when people make claims that Christians and Muslims worship the same God, it's very contradictory, in the sense that if who I take to be God is who you take to simply be a prophet, we can then be worshipping the same God. In which sense I would say that Allah is not the God of Christianity, right? And this really reoccurred to me, and here's where Minister K Strings would come in. Because yesterday I was listening to and singing along with his song Godia Gereka. Now, Minister K Strings mostly sings in Hausa, and as I was just singing along, it just occurred to me that he was saying Yahweh, Yahweh. So please excuse my singing voice, but the song that he was singing is Yahweh, Yahweh, Godia Gereka, something like that, right? That was the song he was singing. And it just occurred to me that he said Yahweh instead of Allah, right? Because although colloquially we know that the God of Islam is Allah, But Allah is also simply God in a lot of languages. Most Hausa people would call God simply as Allah, irrespective of who that God is. Some Arabic Christians would call God simply Allah, irrespective of whether it is the Muslim God or the Christian God. That word Allah just stands to mean God in Hausa and some Arabic languages, right? And then I noticed that he kept on saying Yahweh because he could simply have sung the song as Allah, Allah, Godia Gerika. Like it would still almost exactly mean the same thing. And then, I just thought it was such a little thing, but I thought that is a little thing, but it's really huge because it helps to sort of debunk that contradiction. And this is a very key issue. I don't want to make it seem too extreme, but I would say that there's a sort of weaponization of language in that a Christian is singing, a Hausa Christian or an Arabic Christian is singing to God, the God of Christianity, and is singing Allah. But we all have this subconsciousness such that Allah is almost now a term attributed to Muslims. But when he sang Yahweh, it just pointed me to the fact that God has a name. In the book of Exodus chapter 33, Exodus chapter 33, verses 18 to 20, we see Moses asking God to show him his glory. And in this text, I would read very quickly. Moses responded, "Then show me your glorious presence." And the Lord replied, "I would make all my goodness pass before you, and I would call out my name Yahweh." Now, a few months ago, I read the book by John McCormack. It's titled God Has a Name. And it's such an interesting title because when God simply becomes a word, not attributed to a particular being, then there could be this sense of misinterpretation. And this is actually a key issue for a lot of translators because I know most times when we hear Arab, our mind just goes to Muslim. But there are a good number of Arab Christians, some Muslim converts, but some that have been Christians all their life. But particularly for the Muslim converts, how do you distinct when you're reading the Bible in Arabic? How do you distinct or differentiate Allah, the God of Islam, versus the God of Christianity? And it just points us to the fact that God has a name and his name is Yahweh. In other words, Yahweh is different from Allah. Now, there are a number of similarities. You may say, oh, well, a lot of Bible characters have their place in the Quran. It's very similar stories and all of those things. Well, the God of the Bible is a Trinitarian God, in that the doctrine of the Trinity is also very central to the Christian faith. The word Trinity is not found in the Bible, literal Trinity, but we can read the Bible and come up with the conclusion that there is one God, but this God has manifested himself in three persons, being God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, and each person is God. So God the Father is God, God the Son is God, and God the Holy Spirit is equally God, right? That's very central to the Christian faith, the doctrine of the Trinity. However, the God of Islam is a Unitarian God. Allah is indivisible. In fact, the Quran says he has no son, he beget no one, he has no relation. Is a Unitarian God. He's just one, right? And so you cannot, it's almost contradictory. In fact, I find this very interesting about Islam. And it is in the fact that there are a lot of historical documents, extra biblical documents, that give the account of the fact that Christ died, right? It's a historical consistency. But the Quran is about the only historical document that denies the death of Christ. Now I look at this and I say there is no way Islam and Christianity are compatible, right? You can't put it together, because also central to the Christian faith is that Jesus died, he was buried, and he resurrected. Now when a document or when a holy book comes up and says Jesus did not die, that's a shattering of the entire Christian faith. Let's look at what Apostle Paul says about the death of Jesus Christ in 1 Corinthians 15. I'll be reading 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses, I think I should start from verse 13, right? 1 Corinthians 15:13. For if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, let's take note of this, verse 13, or rather verse 14. If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is useless and your faith is useless. The basis, the center of the Christian faith is that Christ died, he was buried, and he resurrected. And here Apostle Paul says, if you say that Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is useless, our faith is useless, and we apostles will be lying about God, for we have said that God raised Christ from the dead. But that can't be true if there is no resurrection of the dead. Now he goes on to say in verse 19 that if our faith in Christ is only of this life, we are more to be pitied than anyone in the world. Some versions said we are the most miserable of all men. So when the Quran says Christ didn't die, it's an entire shattering of the Christian faith, most miserable of all men. It's not compatible, right? So yes, I have sided with the anti-imperialist in that sense, in that there's a whitewashing of, in quotes, the white man's religion, such that it's very easy for a Christian to say, I don't worship the same God with Shango worshippers. Please, those people, demonic, satanic. But when it comes to Islam, there's a refrain, like, okay, we can, Abraham, please, we do not worship the same God. But then, moving on from Christianity and Islam and that comparison, I would particularly like to point this out before I move on, that the Christian faith is very exclusive, but in a good way, right? I would read Acts chapter 4 verses 12. Acts chapter 4 verses 12 says, there is salvation in no one else. God has given no other name under heaven by which we must be saved. This is Acts chapter 4 verses 12. Then I would also read 1 Timothy 2 verses 5. Yeah, 1 Timothy 2 5. 1 Timothy 2 5 says, for there is no God, or rather, for there is one God and one mediator who can reconcile God and humanity, and it's the man Jesus Christ. Now, we look at this and also text like I am the way, the truth, and the life. Now, I'll also be quoting Professor Chinua Achebe, who I think is phenomenal. But in his book, There Was a Country, he made an interesting statement. And please permit me to just read out what he said. In his book, There Was a Country, which is sort of a personal history of Biafra, it was published in 2012. I'll read out about 2 paragraphs from what he said. He said, I often had periods of oscillating faith as I grew older. period of doubt when I quietly pondered and deeply questioned the absolutionist teachings and interpretation of religion. I struggled with the certitude of Christianity. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Not its accuracy, because as a writer, one understands that there should be such latitude, but the dissolution, the acerbity of its meaning, the lack of options for the outsider, the other. I believe this question has subconsciously deeply influenced my writing. So basically, Professor Chinua Achebe here is saying that statement of I am the way, the truth, and the life holds such certainty. It leaves no room. It's an exclusivity, right? That basically puts Christianity on a pedestal higher than every or any other religion to be the only way to God. And his concern was not about the accuracy of this statement, but how on what that meant for other religions. But it is true that Christ is the way, he is the truth, and he is the life, and there is no other name given under heaven by which man must be saved. Now, except for the sake of political correctness, I think this is actually great news. It is great news because we know Jesus to be God. Now, imagine God saying to humanity, well, there's damnation, but I don't exactly know which way would get you saved. Well, you could try Christianity, perhaps. You could try Islam, maybe. How about Hinduism? There's a probability. Buddhism, probability. Try Ifa worship, probability. That would be intense for the God of the universe not to know the way in which man may be saved. I think the certitude of that statement should give us hope. It should give us hope because we know that there is a certain and a specific way. With such certitude, we can say that when we believe on the name of Jesus Christ, we will be saved, right? That's great news. It doesn't say, oh, try this. If you try this doesn't work, try the other one. It's great news. And yes, I think that would be all that I have to say about Christianity and Islam. But before I go, because of course the title of this discourse is the Anti-imperialist Flaw, and I haven't exactly pointed out any particular flaw. But to quickly wrap up on the flaw that I have, it would be what I call siding with the other. Now, in his book, a man, Alan Jacobs, wrote in his book something that I find quite interesting. He came up with this term called the repugnant cultural order. Basically, the repugnant cultural order would be anyone who has differing opinions from the opinions that we hold, and would usually regard these people as repugnant, as monstrous, right? Because they hold a differing opinion. And he says this arises majorly when we consider people as ideas or ideologies rather than the entirety of who they are, realizing that this person is not just an idea, but they have an entire being, right? They are entire beings with other aspects of their life of which we may agree with, such that we may not agree with people on certain political issues, but we may just get to find out that we both love the same TV show, right? We have the same favorite TV show. And to quote a part from his book very quickly, he said about collaboration, in that we can come to agree with people that would otherwise not have anything to do with for the mere fact of a commonality. Now, here's what he wrote in his book, How to Think, Alan Jacobs. He wrote, those who are subject to the same forces, the same power that be, can find themselves grouped together, sometimes to their own surprise and discomfort. For example, the homosexuals and the Jews in the Nazi Germany. Now, that's a quote from his book, and basically, that we can find ourselves having a sort of commonality with people that we would otherwise disagree with, but for the sake of a power that be, we form a sort of alliance, right? And he gave the example, of course, of the homosexuals and the Jews in Nazi Germany who faced similar oppression, genocide, maybe not to the same degree, but yes, the formation of that alliance to fight the power that be, when on a normal day, Jews and homosexuals, or to put in our day, the LGBTQ community would not form any sort of alliance. Now, it is this point that brings me to what I call the anti-Western sentiment. Now, a few months back, I made a recording that I titled The Secret Oath of Silence, Islamophobia. Now, the central theme that I was trying to drive was that political analysts and journalists, the media in general, had an unfair bias in that they were very critical of Christianity while not applying that same scrutiny to Islam. And I made the case that it was maybe an oversight. Maybe, they just it just so happened to be that Christianity is so mainstream and our flaws are so out there in the public eye to see. I also, give the assumption that it would probably be because, let's be honest, right? We know that it's really tough, maybe not really tough, to criticize Islam for fear of violence of some sort, attacks, and all of those things. So I gave the claim that, save your life, save yourself. If you have other pressing issues to discuss other than criticizing Islam, well, you can go for that. No Christian, at least that we know, most Christians wouldn't attack you with a knife or with a gun when you criticize Christianity or when you call out their pastor for collecting tithe, right? And, I give that case. But I have also come to realize that there is a different reason, or an even more interesting reason, as to why the anti-imperialists are have a special bias towards Islam. Now, here's what I mean. Also picking on I've called him Minister Sheun Kuti. So Sheun Kuti, similar to a lot of other anti-imperialists, similar to a lot of other political analysts, is also very critical of Christianity, right? And how Christianity endorsed slavery. It was the mechanism behind colonization, And I say that not to defend Christianity in any way against the evils of slavery and all of those things, but I also give the case that there is a reason why we do not hear about the trans-Saharan slave trade. Anyways, today I have come up with another hypothesis, and it is what I call the anti-West sentiment. Here's what I mean. So far, remember earlier when we were actively talking about anti-imperialism, I kept mentioning the West, the white man, in as much as anti-imperialism, by definition, is just opposition against any sort of foreign influence, right? But I kept on emphasizing West, white, American, US, because that is how most anti-imperialist thinkers frame it, right? And also, when I made the recording earlier on the hope for Nigeria, I spoke about how a number of anti-colonialists, a number of big names, so to say, when it comes to Africa, had a sort of socialist ideology. If you look at Thomas Sankara, as I earlier said, he was a radical socialist. This was not Africanized socialism. in the way that Chief Obafemi Awolowo was a socialist. Chief Obafemi Awolowo was a democratic socialist. His socialism was not the Marxist socialism. He was more so, you know, what he called Awoism from Awolowo. But Thomas Sankara was full blown Marxist socialist. He quoted a lot of Frederick Engels' works. He had a lot of Marxist ideologies. In fact, I was going through his speech, and to be honest, I would give Thomas Sankara his flowers. And again, as I stated earlier, he was a man ahead of his time. I was going through his speech on what he called the liberation of woman, or rather, women's liberation as an imperative for the African emancipation, in that central to the decolonization, central to the liberation and revolution of Africa is the liberation of women. He would have been, a lover for a lot of feminists. A lot of things he said about women, very appealing, very good things. And however, he had a lot of Marxist ideologies, and central to the Marxist idea is what I would call the oppressor oppressed concept. When Karl Marx came up with the idea of communism or Marxism, the idea was that there are the bourgeoisies who are the oppressors, and there are the proletariats who are the working class and the oppressed. Now, Karl Marx had this very historical materialist view, in that all of history was a class struggle. It was a battle of one class, such that there were the feudal lords and the peasants. That system failed. It was a class struggle. Then now we have in capitalism the bourgeoisie, the proletariat. And he said that system would also fall and gradually would come to the state of communism. So he had this idea. However, this revolution that he so sought did not come to pass. And so a man, an Italian Marxist, Antonio Gramsci, came up with another idea, almost as though Karl Marx had, of course, as I said, a strictly materialist view on human history. Everything was a class struggle. But Antonio Gramsci came up with the idea that the domination, he came up with the term hegemony, which basically has to do with leadership, right? And dominance. And he said the dominance of the bourgeoisie over the proletariat is not strictly an economic domination, but it's cultural. They have there's a dominance in culture, there's a dominance in media, there's a dominance in religion. And so there started to be, especially in academia, an infiltration of neo-Marxist ideologies. It will lead to the formulation of critical theory, critical race theory, feminism. These all have in common the oppressor, the oppressed. And it also places the oppressed as, it almost canonizes the oppressed, such that the oppressed is a sort of saint, incapable of any wrong, and it vilifies the oppressor. The oppressor is eternally evil. They need to crumble, right? And so, of course, Thomas Sankara had a lot of neo-colonialist ideologies, and here's why I say that the refusal to criticize Islam dwells in a sort of anti-Western sentiment, because Islam, but it's at this point that I would like to make a distinction between Islam and Islamism, right? So Islam would be the religion, but henceforth I would be referring to Islamism. Islamism being the political ideology, which is, well, some may say it is based on the actual doctrines, if I may put it that way, of Islam, and some may argue that these are just extremists who have hijacked the peaceful teachings of Islam and are now using it for their own political ambitions. But there's a man who wrote a book, Islamic Exceptionalism, and he basically makes the case that Islam is different from other religions in the sense that it doesn't seek for the separation of religion and state in the way that some Christian nationalists would propose the separation of state and religion, but it actually almost seeks the unification of it. And so when Islamists come up and say that they have this political ideology where they seek a totalitarian system that would be under the Sharia law, it is not far fetched from the actual teachings of Islam. But, anyways, I would be referring to Islamism, which would be the politicization of Islamic doctrine, such that we have the jihadist, Boko Haram would be an example of Islamist, the ISIS, the Al Qaeda, and things like that. Now, all of these groups that I have mentioned so far, the Islamists, have something in common. They have an anti Western idea, right? When Boko Haram came, Boko Haram, loosely put, means Western education is haram, Western education is a sin, right? And the ISIS, the Al Qaeda, they have all of these anti Western sentiments. And so it is in this that I would say, as Alan Jacobs puts it, there is a unification, there is a unifying factor in that both the anti imperialist and the Islamist have an anti Western sentiment. And it is for this reason that there is little or no criticism of the Islamist agenda, right? And yes, basically. Now, remember when I was quoting Alan Jacobs' book, How to Think? It's important for us to note that when sentiments bind people, it doesn't form a good coalition because we pick that singular factor upon which we are united, and we forget that whatever system it is or whatsoever person it is, they are an entirety in and of themselves. And so when anti-imperialists have this unifying factor of the anti-Western sentiment with the Islamist, it's not a good coalition. And here's why. I say it's not a good coalition because I don't think they understand the extent to which they have chosen to liars. And basically, with special emphasis to Thomas Sankara again, when I made the recording on the silver lining for Nigeria, hope for Nigeria, I stated that most thinkers held on to socialist ideologies because they wanted to be anti-Western, right? They saw capitalism as a Western influence, and so they were not necessarily huge fans of Karl Marx. They just wanted to be anti-imperialist, anti-Western, because capitalism had, in quotes, been the driving mechanism of slavery, the havocs of colonialism, and so on. But haven't seen the effect, right? Haven't seen the effect of communism and socialism in, as I stated, the Soviet Union, Vietnam, China, Ethiopia, and the killings that it caused. You'd expect that this idea should probably crumble, right? We shouldn't keep on holding to this anti-Western sentiment and move forward. But a lot of people would still claim that the only reason why it so happened that way is because communism has never really been practiced in reality. But it has been practiced, right? We have seen it come to life and we have seen the havocs with which it has caused. I just say all of this to say that when we form alliances, right, we should look beyond the immediate of what it is. So their actual concerns, right? Their actual concerns of the anti-imperialist, as I stated earlier, foreign aids, loans, also, although it's still been, it's debatable, right? Some economists are like, no, just a transparent, just want to help. Some economists are like, no, we don't want your aid, we do not want your help. And it wasn't only just the acceptance of Marxism or communism. I think also a statement of Thomas Sankara with reference to slavery. He made a statement along the lines of slavery came about by the advent of privatization of property. Now, almost central to capitalism is privatization of property. So it was almost an indirect dash at capitalism to say that capitalism is um is heavily culpable for slavery. But we need to look beyond the immediate, right? And yes, I think I have, gone ahead and over. But to summarize all that I was basically trying to drive at in this, it is the anti-imperialist flaw, and how there is, of course, a selective bias with the exoneration of Islam. And I think I have buttressed the point on the anti imperialist flaw. But to round up on not your mother's son, which is the second part of the topic, it is to point out to the anti imperialist that Islam is not your mother's son. Islam is not your brother. Because when they point out colonialism and Christianity, they fail to point out jihadist conquest and Islam. Because in the north, we cannot deny that there were indeed violent Islamic jihadist conquest. And so Islam also didn't come into Africa by a peaceful means, right? It came with violence. We're not exonerating Christianity and violence, but Islam is not your mother's brother. Islam is not an African religion, as he liked to say. It's also, you know, Arabic, Middle Eastern. So yes, thank you for listening. Thank you so much for listening. If you made it to this point, I hope you gained something. Thank you once again, and I'll do the radio thing. It is 27 minutes past the top of the hour, 2 p.m. And I want to thank you so much for listening. Remember, Jesus is the way, He's the truth, He's the life. And to quote my pastor very quickly, it is not a matter of I love my pastor, I love my church. Your eternal destiny is at stake here. So I hope you take this in good faith, and yes, thank you. Bye.